I bring this up not because of the OAuth specification itself, but what it represents, and that's a way to enable authorization and authentication while respecting the P's of identity. So privacy and policy and permissioning can be maintained, implemented, and handled while managing authentication and authorization. That's very important. That specification and dance is what the future of a foundation of authorization for context automation. Finally, I have a couple more. The identity selector, this would be an info card, a Zigo selector, or the Higgins project. Unfortunately, the only of these three, well, fortunately or not, the only of these three actually doing any innovation is a Zigo. Thank you, Paul. Is he still here? No. But let's give him a round of applause anyway. And, right, Mike, yeah. And Microsoft and Novell, in the meantime, are, completely lost about what to do. No surprise there. Even with the fact that John Udell's there, they don't know what to do. So M&Ms, this is my term, and I came up with it, and what it stands for is this is where the real opportunity for a developer to write a rule with Kynetx lies, and that's when you find and understand the mix-ups and mash-ups of data for context automation. So I'll explain that a little more in a second. So let's look at the contextual triangle. The three elements that make context automation work, this is where the rubber meets the road here, are these three elements. The active client, the contextual services, and the contextual information source. So the active client can be a selector or a browser extension, or in some cases can be the bookmark. Contextual services, the only company doing that is Kynetx, of course, with KRL. And the contextual information source is the data. And Axiom, as they were talking about just prior to me, is a good source of contextual information, as well as many other sources. With those three, you get those combined together, that's when you can start providing context. So now let's talk about these transitioning technologies. One is the identity model. This is the graphic that I use to represent the identity model, and that's the letter I and D with the red hook. Then the communication approach, that's the inverted pyramids. And I showed you that 6 months ago again, and I'll explain a little bit more of that in a second. And then finally, an intention viewpoint. So let's go over the transition, the state of transition of each of these. We are in a state of transition between identity models. So the graphic on the left there, the little ID with the dot, that's the cookie model. And the one on the right is the selector-based model. We are moving away from cookies towards a selector architecture for identity, and that's both the A's and the P's. Now the question would be, is there an alternative to the selector? The answer is no. Let me know if you come up with one or you see one. OpenID is not a selector. It's not an alternative to the identity model to take us where we need to go for context automation. The selector is. We may as well move towards that. So we're also in transition from a communication approach. This is, I hope, what Chad talked about, certainly what Tim Kristen talked about a year ago, and that is the organization model, which is represented by the graphic on the left, track and target, top-down, traditional media economy. And the other is where you add bottom-up, permission, private, policy-based, related communication controlled by the user with an organization. It's not that one replaces the other, they're combined. Now, here's where I bring back Joe and Jock. Now, if you use track and target to communicate to these two guys, one of them is going to fail to understand what you're talking about. One's passion is life and home, and the other is the sea. So, how do you know, or how are you able to know what a related conversation with those two very diametrically opposed people would be? Well, by understanding enough about that person to do that within context. So finally, we're in transition from an intention viewpoint, and Phil talked about this where the past was, where you're going to go today, which is the road with the telephone poles. Where are you going to go? Where are you going to arrive? And the light bulb is, what are you up to? What's your intention? What are you thinking about? What's your passion? So, to wrap this up, the contextual triangle then is made of these three elements. So the one on the left, as I said before, is the active client. On the top is the contextual services, in this case KRL. And over on the right, some data source or mashup or mismatch of data sources. So,
I wouldn't trade your life for 1 hour of home.
His context is very different than Jacques, who...
Come with me to where the Southern Cross lies over your shoulder.
He's going to travel and sail as opposed to stay home. And so then, to wrap this up then, Steve asked me to be a little more specific about distinguishing mismatches and mashups. So mismatches are where you have mismatched like-kind data. So, for example, if you had profiles of Joe and Jock, and you looked at it in, let's say, Facebook, if you didn't have an element in that person's profile that one is life and home and the other's travel and sales, you might think that communicating with them would be the same exercise. But by having corrected the mismatch of that like-kind data of their profile, then you're capable of perhaps communicating and creating a relatedness between you and that person in a different way by matching up the like-kind data. So then a mashup is where you combine unlike-kind data. An example of that would be taking something completely different than a social website or a profile of a person, and maybe it would be their Twitter feed or something else, something that's not related to their profile. You can mash those up and then create a context that way. So, in summary, then, my besides all the language that hopefully you got some elements of here, this contextual triangle is the magic that makes context automation work. Again, it's the active client over on the left bottom corner, the server or KRL up at the top, and the data on the right. So that's the end of my presentation, and any questions, then would be happy to.
Any questions for Craig?
Do you do weddings?